welcome everybody. So as I say, please do interact throughout this, so I don't feel like I'm just talking to myself. We will have a few exercises and try and get a bit of conversation going at various points. The session is scheduled for an hour and a half. I'm not sure if we'll need all of that time. We'll try and have a break. I used to try and cram all this into an hour, but that was a bit difficult, a bit too much going on for an hour. So we might not need the full hour and a half. And as I say, we'll try and have a break. So a quick overview of what I'm planning to cover today. So we'll start with a general sort of introduction to the principles of open research, tell you a little bit about open research at Leeds and how it's strategically important for the university at the moment, and the sector, in fact. Talk a bit about open and transparent research and just give you an insight into some of the sort of basic principles. Reproducibility, reproducible research, we'll talk a lot about reproducibility. Visible research, which is PGR researches that might be of interest to you. You're making sure that your research is visible and it's beneficial to have it out in the public domain and that kind of thing. And then talk a bit about networks and support, including things like OD and PL. So I invited Emily, as I say, my new colleague, to sort of learn from one another how we can support this type of activity across the university. So we'll start with a Menti Poll. Now, I'm not sure if you've used Menti before, so this is just to try and sort of a bit of an icebreaker. If you go to menti.com and enter that code, I'll also share a direct link, in fact, in the chat. Bear with me. So you can go on a phone or on another browser window or whatever, and just say, what do you understand by open research? I was interested in sort of the perspectives you may already have. But yeah, making research available to all, research that's accessible by everybody, that isn't behind a paywall. Yeah, we'll talk certainly about open access to publications, which is a big part of it, and paywalls, etc. Transparent is a good word. Collaboration is a good word. Yeah, we'll talk a lot about collaboration. Knowledge and ideas, I like that. That sort of takes it beyond research, doesn't it? And thinking about knowledge and ideas accessible to all. Yeah, so we're talking about getting certainly outside the ivory tower to the public, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Things like citizen science, part of open research. Democratized access. Yeah, I like the word democratized as well. We talk about that a lot in terms of the global south, perhaps. The countries that are less wealthy than the global north, and that has obviously impacts on how research can be accessed or even published. Actually, now we'll talk a bit about that as well. Somebody else has said collaborative, yeah, and open sharing. Open to all, though I'm not sure about the extent of openness in some disciplines. So again, yeah, we will certainly talk about disciplinary differences, because as I was sort of at pains to say early on, that's certainly, and it does vary by discipline, both in principle and practice and culture, I think. So hopefully communicate and sharing, yeah, communication, collaboration. So now you might have already seen the bar slide, so hopefully it'll go on to the next slide. So it looks like colleagues have already input to that. So I'm just interested as well to get a sense of how familiar you may or may not be with some of these terms. So just indicate with a slider. I think it should be fairly intuitive to use. Your familiarity with green and gold open access, Creative Commons licenses, the White Rose Research Online, fair data, reproducibility. These are terms I've chosen really much at random. A lot more I could have used. Orchid, preregistration, and harking. So obviously on the left-hand side, you've never heard of it, and then slider bar right up to the right-hand side, I know all about it. You can see colleagues are contributing. We've had 8 so far.
It's quite interesting. We're getting a bit higher for reproducibility and Orchid than, for example, green and gold open access, where again it depends on the audience, depends who's in the room. Where the green gold open access for some will be a very well understood concept, wouldn't it? The publication options, people who are actually sort of in the thick of publishing academic papers. So that's interesting.
Yeah, fair data is quite low. We'll touch on that. White Rose Research Online, we'll tell you about that. That's just the University of Leeds repository. Well, actually collaborative repository collaboration again with the White Rose partners, which is York and Sheffield. We'll talk quite a lot about reproducibility. Orchid, if you haven't got one, get one. I'll tell you how to do that. You can just go, if you Google Orchid, you'll find it. But everybody is strongly encouraged, should we say, to have an Orchid. I'll tell you a bit about what that is. Pre-registration, as expected, relatively low. I'm interested that people are aware of it, though. That might be you, though, Dorka, is it? And harking, again, quite low. We'll talk a bit about what harking as well, just to tell you at this point that it stands for an acronym. It's hypothesizing after results are known, and a so-called questionable research practice that can either be deliberate, trying to get the, or it can be unconscious. So we'll talk a bit about that as well. So that's great. Thank you very much. So as I say, that was just really just to get us going. So I've got a definition here of open science that I quite like from Foster. So this is a European Union project that defines open science as the practice of science in such a way that others can collaborate. So that was a word that came up earlier. And contribute where research data, lab notes and other research processes are freely available under terms that enable reuse, redistribution and reproduction. So that's Creative Commons licensing. We'll talk about licensing in a moment, of the research and its underlying data and methods. So as I say, that's a definition of open science from the Foster project. Now we tend to, the sector in general in the UK tends to use the term open research to be more inclusive of the humanities. Etymologically, actually, science, I think in many European languages does encompass the humanities, but not so much in English. So we tend to use the term open research, but the same principles apply. And you can see from the right-hand side there's an image of some of the skills. Again, that's from another project called the Open Science Monitors, which sort of identifies some of the different areas that you'll need to familiarise yourself. And this is, we'll talk about how this is developing across the sector, and increasingly if you are earlier in your academic career, and it's only going to get more important, you'll see things there about open access to publications. We'll talk about open research data and open scholarly communication. So they're sort of three segments that we'll talk about today. Now, in terms of open research at Leeds, it is a really important strategic component of the university strategy at the moment. So we'll talk a lot more about reproducible research and these things like responsible metrics. So historically, research has been, motivated by things like journal impact factor. So that's the perceived value of a journal. That doesn't really tell you anything about the quality of research. When we're trying to get away from that sort of metric as part of the broadening research culture. So open research is a really important component of that. And at Leeds, we define the 5 key aspects of open research being open access. We'll start talking about that in a bit more detail in a moment. So that's publications, the journal articles, open data. So the data that underlies those journal articles. Now, data is perhaps a problematic word as well in some contexts, because, historians talk about data, perhaps. I mean, you tend to think of spreadsheets maybe and numbers and hard science, but data can be anything. It could be archival research or images or a wide range of material. But I think the terminology can be off-putting for some disciplines more than others. Then we talk about open platforms, tools and services. So that's again not being locked into sort of tools that are managed by big commercial companies and open source software and that kind of thing. We'll touch on that today. That's not an area I know a huge amount about. We work again with colleagues across the university in research IT and that kind of thing. So again, as I say, I've got a colleague here today from OD and PL, and really a collaborative effort, trying to understand what some of these issues mean. An open approach to conducting research, and transparency and public engagement. So things like citizen science and really trying to get outside the ivory towers, as I say. And again, I keep emphasising this aspect, not least because I was, aware of the different colleagues that tend to come to this and from a wide range of different disciplines. So the disciplinary differences is a really interesting area that we're trying to understand as a university and as a sector. So really sort of encourage you as we go along today and in general to get involved in the conversation and try and decide, to help us decide what open research means in different disciplines. The University of Leeds has actually very recently, just last month, published an open research statement. So that's just an extract from there. Perhaps actually I've got it here. I can fire the link in. So this is on the research and innovation. Oh, thanks, Rachel. So that's just an extract from that, but just to highlight that, it's a very high level sort of document, but this sort of, again, underpins the strategic direction the university is trying to go in with this stuff. So really just to have a look at that, you'll see it's quite values led, and it's got certain commitments around training and awareness, and as I say, really just emphasises the strategic importance of this for the university at the moment. And many other universities have similar statements. You know, we're one of many to be exploring this sort of area. Open and transparent research. So we'll start with a discussion around, I mean, the terms gold and green, as we had in the slide earlier on. So in a nutshell, I mean, the terminology is not necessarily helpful, but historically, you may have already encountered paywall. We had the word paywall before. So historically, the way that research access has been granted is through a subscription model. So a university library like ours at Leeds would pay a considerable amount of money, millions, we're talking an awful lot of money, for subscription access to journals through the big commercial publishers like Elsevier or Springer, etc. Now, of course, that means that unless you're part of a university with access through that library subscription, you can't actually access that material. And you'll see, you know, it can cost $50 or even more, $100 sometimes, or $130, I think, to access a single paper, you know, on this subscription model. So historically, there's been a couple of models of open access to ensure openly available research to all. So green open access is where a paper is published in a subscription journal. The copyright would be signed over to that journal. Again, we're trying to get away from that. We won't go into too much detail about that, but there's a lot of discussion around this. You know, it is your work after all, and please don't give it away to, you know, talk to us if your publishers are asking you to give them your copyright, because increasingly we're trying to encourage people to retain their own copyright. But historically, green open access has been making a version of a paper available through a repository like the White Rose Research Online repository, and perhaps Rachel could post a link to that as well. And you, as students and PGRs here at the university, have access to that repository. You can, any work you publish, you can go into that repository through a system called Symplectic. So you can log into that system. Again, there's lots of information on the website about that. There's no cost involved with that process. We in the library will check any copyright issues with that and make sure that the right version is made available in line with the publisher's stipulations, etc. Now, at the same time, there's something called gold open access, which is free to read on the publisher's website, but this tends to be based on the payment of what's called an article processing charge. So it's like an inversion of the business model. Rather than paying a subscription fee, you actually pay to publish your research, which means that anybody can publish it. But it's potentially very expensive. I mean, just while we're talking, perhaps if anybody would like to guess without looking it up, the maximum cost for an APC for the Nature suite of journals, which is a very high impact journal, perhaps just tell me in the chat how much you think they might charge for an APC. So that's gold open access, and the area is changing quite dramatically at the moment. And Jonathan, my colleagues here today, and as a university, we have agreements now with a lot of publishers, so you may be able to publish gold without actually having to find additional funding, but it is quite complex. There's lots of information online. If you are publishing or you need to know more about that, get in touch and we'll help you, because we know how difficult it can be. Well, if I tell you it's actually $9,000, is it, Jonathan? Perhaps you can correct me. Is it still that fee for Nature to publish one article in Nature? In £9,000 or euros, I think. So it's absolutely astronomical, and there's a lot of discussion around this, you know, in terms of this is what the responsible metrics is about. They can charge that because people want to get in these high impact journals, etc. So it's really just trying to change that culture. Now, the other aspect of open aspect is that's more perhaps on the open research side is preprints. So preprints is a version of a paper that has that precedes formal peer review. Now, the copyright belongs to you in that case, and there's a wide range of preprint servers in many disciplines, ranging from economics to physics to earth sciences, you know, whatever discipline you're in. Bioarchive, there's someone listed at the bottom, chemistry, psychology, archive, the oldest, from 1991. Now, again, historically, journals didn't necessarily approve of this process because, you know, they were worried that would affect their business model, etc. But increasingly, they are more common. It came into its own really through the coronavirus pandemic in health in particular, because it can take quite a long time for journals to go through peer review, and obviously speed was of the essence in some respects in terms of COVID, for example, and making sure that the science was available much more quickly. Obviously, there's issues with that in terms of things being picked up by the media. If anybody remembers, hydroxychloroquine was the miracle cure that Trump kept going on about, and that actually came from a preprint that was later discredited. So there are issues with preprint culture, but it's certainly a growing area, and again, it varies by discipline. Lots more information on the library website around this, and interested again how it affects your own disciplines. Just to flag up a really useful extension that I use. So there's something called onpaywall.org. If you go to onpaywall.org, you can add a browser extension. I might be able to show it you later, but it'll give you a little green padlock on the side of your browser screen. And if you do hit a paywall, just hit that and it'll find an open access version in a repository like the White Rose repository if one exists. So if it's grayed out, there isn't one. But increasingly there will be. There'll be a green link. So it's a really nice tool that I always have running on my browser. And then if you hit an article that you can't access, just press the button and it'll find you, just direct you straight to a version in the repository that you can read for free. So as I say, we talked about preprints and the rapid growth in through COVID-19 in particular. Increasingly, they're allowed in grant applications, the welcome trust of long-supported preprints, which is an important funder in health research. That's a staggering statistic from medRxiv through COVID. So there were going up to 7,000 posted in the first 6 months of the pandemic, which was up from 807, so an increase of 739% in the first 6 months of the pandemic, which gives you an indication of the drive through the rapid dissemination of science in that context. So the other component of open and transparent research is open and fair data. So this was the other term we had, fair data. Now the term we tend to use, which comes from Horizon 2020, which is a European funder, is that data should be as open as possible, as closed as necessary. So obviously, wherever possible, we're advocating that data be open, but that's not always possible. It may be sensitive, or ethical reasons it can't be shared, or commercial partnerships, that kind of thing. We do another course, Rachel and I, and to talk about data management in a lot more detail. So come along to that if you haven't already. But then we also talk about fair data. So just because data can't be open, it doesn't mean it can't be findable and accessible. So we have a repository here at Leeds that will enable you to share data in a controlled manner. So you can put stipulations on how and why that could be used, and we'll approve requests to that, with an end user agreement, that kind of thing. So that's fair data, making sure it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Interoperable and reusable is to do with machine readable, etc. We won't go into that in too much detail, but just to emphasize that data doesn't have to necessarily be open to be useful and to be valuable for reproducible research. And really it's based on the fact that publicly funded research data should be openly available to the maximum extent possible. You should have a data management plan. If you haven't done one yet, again, as I say, come to us. Rachel and I are based in the research data team, and we can help you with a data management plan. If you are doing a PGR and you're doing a PhD, you will need one at transfer. So that's something you can liaise with your supervisor on. And if you're unsure of anything around that, come to us. And that's to make sure your data is managed properly throughout the life cycle, and making sure that it can be shared at the end of the project with your thesis, etc. In terms of any consent, all this kind of thing, then, or storage, and etc. You might need to think about. Software and code, very often may not affect you. Historians may not, but increasingly, there's interdisciplinary stuff around sort of digital humanities, this kind of thing. But software and code is an important component of a lot of research, again, in terms of reproducibility. So, as I say, the word data can be limiting, perhaps. So it's just trying to think more broadly about all the various different types of material you could and should share. And a lot of funders have requirements now if you are going for funding, or if you're funded already, for a data management plan, or increasingly again, to get away from this data terminology, there was called there as an output management plan. So what we're really trying to encourage is thinking about all the different components of the research process as a first-class research output in their own right. You know, it's not just about the journal article, it's about the data, it's about the protocols, it's about the software and code. Every different component of the research process is as important as each other and should be treated as such. That was another term we had on there. So Creative Commons licensing is an open license. So think of it as some rights reserved. So if you as a researcher or just as an individual or a creative individual, etc., put something online, it is your copyright by definition. It's a statutory right, and by definition it's all rights reserved. So if I find something of yours online, I can't use that without your permission. Of course, that's not all the way it works, but that is you know, statutory rights under copyright law. So if you put a Creative Commons license on it, which is just up to you as an individual to assign this, you're enabling explicitly reuse and redistribution and reproduction under specific terms. So the one that we recommend is something called attribution, CC BY, as the most least restrictive, and all that's saying is that you're happy for other people to reuse that data, that material, whatever it may be, as long as they attribute you, just so standard academic practice. But there are more restrictive flavors of that license as well. And again, we won't go into too much detail around that, but if you're, you know, you can stipulate non-commercial clauses, that kind of thing, or share alike, which means that another user can't put a more restrictive license on it. They have to use your license, etc. And again, lots more support on the library. And, you know, if you are putting stuff in the public domain and you're not sure about licensing, just come and speak to us and we can help you with that. Software and code, we've already mentioned. So again, this is the concept of making your treating all research outputs as a valuable output in their own right. So we strongly encourage any code, software and code to be citable. So if you use something called GitHub, again, I don't know how many colleagues, perhaps tell us in the chat if you are using software and code as part of your research. You can give it a DOI, which is a digital object identifier. You will have seen these strings of numbers on publications and increasingly data sets and software. So again, it's making sure that everything's treated as a first-class research object. Licensing is slightly different for software. We tend to recommend here the MIT license, which is equivalent really to the CC BY Creative Commons license, but there are other flavors again. And again, already you've been no doubt seeing the complexities around this, and I'm certainly not an expert in this, but we have colleagues in research IT, and if you are wanting to license your own software or code or reuse code, there's lots of advice available around the university to help you with that. All that leads us to sort of benefit, the first benefit of open research, which is really around faster dissemination and impact. There's a couple of research papers there that you may be interested in looking up. And really what we're sort of advocating is that open should be the default, not the exception. So historically, you know, it's been an effort to make stuff open, but increasingly the sector and certainly the University of Leeds is striving to make things open by default. As we said, that's not always possible because of ethical issues with data, etc. But by and large, it's, you know, we are encouraging people to share material early as possible to enable faster dissemination and impact of that research, both for you as an individual, for science as a whole, and for the university and for the sector. So actually what we do have now as a university is a lot of agreements with journals negotiated by JISC, which is a national body. So my colleague who's here today, Jonathan, liaises with this in particular. And actually you will be able to publish open access with no extra cost to you, because what's happening now is we're bundling up the costs as a sector. So we're still paying the journals, the commercial publishers, but rather than the subscription only, they're actually bundling in the open access costs as well. So it won't affect it be every journal, but it's certainly changing, and you will actually be able to access, you won't necessarily need to access funds. So but that may be an issue, you know, in some cases you won't be able to access funds for certain journals, and you won't be able to publish. You're quite right, and I think that's a good point. But just to emphasize that the sector is changing and there is a lot of progress in this area. So I hope that makes sense, and you'll find a lot more information on the library open access web pages. White Rose research online was the thing I asked before, and it seemed the knowledge was quite low. So again, that is the University of Leeds shared repository in York and Sheffield. More relevant to you as PGRs, perhaps first before that, is the White Rose e-thesis online repository, which is RIO as we call it, as opposed to RO. Which is where your thesis will end up. Open access. You can stipulate an embargo if you wish, but again, we'd encourage open access. If you haven't seen that already, just Google it or find it, or somebody could post a link. And any thesis that's undertaken at any of the 3 universities will be in the White Rose eThesis online repository. Thanks, Rachel. Now, the third repository we have is the Research Data Leads repository. So that's the one that Rachel and I look after. So any data sets can go into that repository. There may, however, be a better option depending on your discipline that's more disciplinary specific. There's loads of repositories out there, lots of third-party repositories. Zenodo is an example, or Figshare, they're general repositories, or if you're working in, I don't know, genetics, there's GenBank, or if you're funded by NERC, with the Natural Environment Research Council, they have their own data centres for sort of earth sciences and that kind of thing. Again, if you're not sure, speak to us and we can help you. Some journals partner with different data repositories, etc. And again, really just to emphasize that we're talking about data in the general sense, not just spreadsheets and numbers, but it could be images, or we've got some quite interesting data sets of experimental music performances. Depending on your research, data can be many different things, and we can facilitate sharing those safely and responsibly and openly licensed through our repositories. So if you want to explore that, please do get in touch. So I've got a question for you now in terms of benefit 2, and that is, who is most likely to reuse your data in the future? So please just post in the chat with your likely answers to that question. I mean, it's a slight trick question. I mean, we really emphasize, as a benefit to you is you. It's, you are very likely to be the next person that uses this research. Now, obviously, when you leave the University of Leeds, perhaps, you get that job at Oxford or Cambridge, etc. If your data's stored safely in a repository, then you can access that yourself, openly licensed, etc. So we really, it's not all about altruism and sharing data for the good of the sector, but or science, but there's clear benefits for you as an individual as well. So, but there are obviously important benefits for science as a whole, which brings us on to reproducible research. So we're talking a lot about data and how that data is analysed for the same results. Now, again, I'm conscious that this may not be relevant to all disciplines. If it's the hard sciences is one thing. If the humanities, does the concept of reproducibility even make sense? Perhaps we'll have a discussion, hopefully, in a moment around whether or not that's the case. But it's certainly in STEM subjects, ideally you take the same data, you perform the same analysis, you get the same results. Now, that's not always necessarily been the case. So I've got a bit of an exercise here, so it's probably a good time to just have a 5-minute break, just so I can have a drink as much as anything. And I'll leave you with this question that we'll perhaps try and have a discussion, and really, please do contribute either in the chat or verbally if you'd like. So we'll just have 5 minutes and then discuss this when we get back. So the question is, a researcher in your school has published a highly cited research paper. So again, really interested in your specific context of your own research. And a professor at another institution has reported that they cannot replicate the reported research findings. So considering your own discipline, obviously from your own point of view, what information and documentation would be needed for your colleagues to demonstrate how their findings can be replicated? And as I say, just really interested to hear your perspectives from different disciplines. I mean, any thoughts from your own disciplinary perspective on what type of information and documentation would be necessary to demonstrate how specific findings can be replicated? As I say, particularly interested in whether this concept of reproducibility even makes sense to your discipline. I mean, would it make sense to you, Mark? I guess in fine art, I'm guessing perhaps not necessarily.
I must admit, I can't see how it would, because I'm new to it. I'm not really sure, but
yeah. No, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm just very conscious that we talk about this term reproducibility, and this is one of the issues we have. You see, as a
something I am interested in. I did a project photographing and interviewing all kinds of academics at Manchester University in around the subject of graphene, which is a new material. which has got absolutely huge funding behind it. It's possibly the next Silicon and that kind of stuff. And so the whole question of how open data should be when China and South Korea are fighting the UK for supremacy. And I spoke to a very interesting Chinese PhD student who said that the Chinese government were giving money to any academic who produced a patent. And then the Russian lead, who had a Nobel Prize, in front of a parliamentary committee, was talking about how he's completely opposed to that because he wanted to keep it open. So I'm kind of interested in where the subject gets very big. I mean, obviously this is for our purposes here, but it's a huge subject and it's political.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, it clearly is political, especially in the world we live in now, and it's easy to be idealistic, isn't it? When actually,
if you know what's going on with semiconductors and what's happening between America and China at the moment, you know, I'm wondering, what about people involved in that? For me, with arts practice, I would just like to share everything that I ethics can, you know.
I mean, practice research is an interesting one. I don't know, perhaps you could comment on that, Rachel. There's a few comments I'll come to in a moment, but you've been involved with some practice research.
Well, as was being suggested, it can be as much about the process, so you can almost see the final exhibition or the final photograph or the final concert or whatever it is, a bit like a journal article. There's a kind of summary of everything that's gone before to prepare for it. So I think documenting those processes and sharing processes, again, the language is evolving, how we actually talk in a common way around these different output types. But that was good to hear that you're keen to share from an arts perspective all the different sorts of steps and materials within ethical restriction. Yeah.
Nice.
And if you haven't heard of it, Mark, you may be interested in the Sparkle project. I'll just post a link in there. So that's around, it's a clever acronym, Sustaining Practice Assets for Research, Knowledge, Learning and Engagement. So this is about practice research, and Scott, who's leading that, is a musician, but, you know, it could relate to art, etc.
Right.
So that might be something that's...
Thank you. In fact, I was thinking of doing something with a participatory group as part of Leeds 2023. And because we won't have a finished product by that time, I'm wondering whether we could kind of lay bare our working process and just discuss that with an audience, you know. So, so this is all interesting to me. Yeah. Thank you.
And that, you can see there, you'd need, obviously, and that's what we talk about consent. Somebody's put in the chat, I see data management plan, and that's the sort of thing you pick up in a data management plan, making sure you're getting the right consent, because it's really common for us to, whether it's participatory research, etc., or interviews or whatever it is, and people haven't got the right wording or ethical approval or whatever it may be to actually share that research later, which means you can't share it because you haven't got the right consent. So that's the value of a data management plan, you know, thinking it through right from the beginning.
I've always been rubbish at model release forms, so that's good in photography when you get people to agree. So this is good to know. This is useful. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, you know, the thing that we sort of keep reiterating as well, we know, you know, this is tricky stuff, and we're really just encouraging you to speak to us if necessary. But in terms of transparent and reproducible research, so there's a lot, it's been variously called, I mean, we're trying to get away from the terminology, I think, as a sector, but the reproducibility crisis, as it's been termed. So this is an interesting paper from Nature, ironically, very expensive, which highlighted that several high-profile social science studies could not be independently replicated, and similar. It's come from psychology, actually, largely. I mean, psychology, there's been some quite high-profile examples, you know, a lot of debate whether psychology is even a science, etc., and how difficult it can be to reproduce. But increasingly, it's been recognised that actually this is an issue in a wide range of disciplines, not just psychology, but the biomedical sciences, and you know, it's potentially quite an issue across virtually every discipline. And obviously ensuring that analyses and methodology, we've been saying, are fully transparent throughout the research cycle means you can better contribute to science and research, reproducibility, but also saving time and enabling others to check your results. So that paper's worth a look if you're interested in sort of some of the quite worrying, actually, data, you know, in terms of public trust in science, etc., and making sure that, I mean, there was a high-profile one recently, wasn't there? What was that one around Parkinson's? Was it Parkinson's or Alzheimer's? I'll look it up in a moment. But there was data was fabricated or something for Alzheimer's research, and it's means that a lot of the research over the past 20 years is just defunct because the data was I think that was nefarious practice. But so it is a huge issue in terms of making sure that it doesn't compromise treatments for Alzheimer's or whatever it may be. I'm not sure if you can make that out. I've only got a tiny screen here, but this is from another paper from 2016, talking to a large sample of scientists about reproducibility and some of the issues that they identified as being responsible for some of these problems in terms of reproducibility, pressure to publish. So again, this is a cultural aspect, in terms of salami slicing, getting loads of papers out of the same data, this kind of thing. Methods and code unavailable is highlighted there. So that's worth a look as well in terms of the different issues that, has been identified as being part of this problem. So this was another term we used. I was quite interested that quite a few colleagues seem to perhaps be familiar with this, maybe because we have got psychologists here. But pre-registration is something that I've learned about relatively recently from a colleague with a psychology background, and it has come from psychology. But essentially, what pre-registration is to try and mitigate what's called questionable research practices by registering a proposed studies design, methods and analysis plan even before you collect any data, and submitting that to a public registry so it's clearly documented what you're going to do, even what statistical tests you're going to carry out, etc. And the intention is to separate hypothesis generating or exploratory research from hypothesis testing or confirmatory research. The most popular tool for actually registering these things is something called the Open Science Framework, which is free to use. You can put data in there, all sorts of things. That's worth a look as well. Now, as I say, this has come from psychology, but there's a wide range. I've spoken to a wide range of colleagues who recognise that these are issues in their disciplines as well. It's not necessarily used yet, but I think pre-registration is a really interesting area that is developing. I spoke to earth scientists, for example, who just said, yeah, I can see the value of this and why it might work for us, but it's not something we do yet. So it's just something to perhaps familiarise yourselves with, and I expect will grow in a range of disciplines over the coming years. And as I say, the term harking I mentioned before is hypothesizing after results are known. So this is sort of illustrating the cartoon there with the sharpshooter. He's shot his bullets into a wall and then he's drawing the target around them afterwards. Hypothesizing after just an illustration of that. P-hacking or data torture, as the saying goes. So undertaking multiple statistical tests until you get a significant result, and that's one of the questionable research practices that is mitigated by pre-registering, because you've already highlighted that you're going to do such and such a test. And if that's not significant, yes, you can exploratory do another test, but at least you've identified that it's just about transparency and making sure it's quite clear whether you are doing exploratory or confirmatory research. And there's lots of initiatives around this. Another tool called Octopus, which has just been launched, which I'll perhaps mention in a moment if we have time, which is related to this sort of stuff as well, and sort of breaking out all the different components of the research process. As I say, pre-registration has come from psychology, but there's also been explored in the context of qualitative research as well. We had a talk from a colleague recently that is recorded, actually, if I'll try and find that later, in terms of how this may be relevant to qualitative research as well. And there is actually, that's a screenshot from the Open Science Framework, so there is a form based on qualitative pre-registration there. So if you are in qualitative research, it's not necessarily irrelevant, and it might be worth a look as well. I think it's important as well to recognise the challenges of all this stuff. It is a culture change, and there's clearly a time cost, whether that's preparing data or pre-registering, whatever it may be, is time consuming. And also the incentive structure isn't yet in place. So you mentioned at the top journal impact factor, and getting your research into Nature, whatever it may be, and having that impact and getting in the media or whatever. But and unless we are able to incentivize some of these practices as a university, as a sector, which is what we're doing, then what we're trying to do, then we're not going to achieve that cultural change. There's lots of policy out there, you know, which are hitting people with sticks to make the work open access and increasingly sharing data, but there's not enough carrots actually, you know, that really motivates people to do that. And I think that we see that with the relatively low numbers to these sections, you know. Yeah, thanks, Mark. That there's lots of work still to do to raise awareness of these practices, the value to science, but also in trying to incentivize it as well. And there's an interesting paper there in terms of, as I think I've got early career colleagues here, so benefits, tips, and early career and beyond is worth a look in PLOS biology there. So, in terms of benefit 3, we're really advocating, you know, and as I say, really thank you for coming along today, and be the change you want to see, you know. But many of you are, if not all, early career researchers or PGRs, and by helping to change academic culture, you benefit everyone, you know, you benefit society, you know. And if your group or colleagues or peers aren't doing it, you know, initiate the discussion, send them our way, you know, and this is certainly the way science is going, or research is going, and you know, it will stand you in good stead career-wise, certainly as time goes by. Which brings you on to the benefit for you as making your own research and profile more visible. So I mentioned Orchid. As I say, if you haven't got one, do get one. It's free. And think of it as a DOI for a person. So if you're got a common name, for example, it differentiates you from any other John Smith out there. But also it's used increasingly by a lot of systems to link up different components of whether it's data sets or pre-registration. You know, increasingly you can use your Orchid in all sorts of different systems, and it joins up your publication record. Link it to the Symplectic account. Again, if you're not sure about this, look on the website. We can help you with anything. This is an old slide. Orchid Write coming soon. It's actually there now. So in the Symplectic system, if you've got any publications that are in that system, you can write that data and your affiliation over to your Orchid profile. Makes it a bit easier. And again, if you're not sure how to use it, give us a shout and we can help you with that. But yeah, there is actually a mandate such that it is that everybody has to have an Orchid, whether staff and PGRs. And you will need one to submit your thesis to Rio at the end of your PhD as well. So, but there's not much point getting it then, you know, just as you know, get it now and make sure that you're using it throughout your career here at Leeds and beyond. Then you take it with you. It belongs to you. It's nothing to do with the university. It's your own identifier. Social media is a really valuable tool. I mean, I've got Twitter on there as well. I mean, Twitter's an interesting one. I mean, if anybody is on Twitter at the moment, of course, is Twitter dying or not? I'm not sure. That Elon Musk's bought it recently, and it does highlight the importance actually of open networks, because nobody knows quite now. It's a really important tool for a lot of scientists actually in engaging with the public, and nobody's quite sure what he's going to do with Twitter now. But then there's blogs and there's tools like Mendeley and ResearchGate. There's lots of different slides out there, tools out there that you can use to expose your research. So I'm just going to show you quickly an example of, I meant to do a bit of Blue Peter on this, but I'll share my screen and we can do it as we go along, hopefully. So I'll share my screen. So this is quite a nice example. That is the basis of one of the case studies that I mentioned that we'll show you again in a moment. You can have a look. So this is a research paper. Now I am actually on campus, but I'm on the EduRoam network. So you can see there I could access this through, because obviously this is behind a paywall and I'm part of the University of Leeds, so I could access this through the subscription model if I wanted to purchase it. Oh, it's a bargain, isn't it? Look, it's only going to cost me $25 to access that. However, I mentioned earlier the unpaywall extension, so you can see there on the right hand side the green tab, because I'm running this browser extension, and if I click that, that's going to take me through to a version, actually not in our repository. It's the colleague that wrote this paper. He was at Glasgow. He's actually back at Leeds now, but so this is taken us to the accepted version in that repository, which is publicly accessible for anybody to read. So that just shows you how that particular tool works. Now I will access. I'm not going to have the data access statement there, am I? If I was to show you the full paper, you would see a citation to the data that's associated with this, which this is the data set in our repository, which is, as you can see, is linked back through to the paper here, which is what we were just looking at, and to the version we were just looking at in the Glasgow repository, but it's also in our repository here at Leeds. So this is White Rose Research Online that we were talking about. So this is the version archived through Green Open Access that's openly accessible there. You can see this is under a Creative Commons license, as we were discussing before. These are the authors on there. So these are the orchids of those individuals. So Jiren Zhu is the colleague who, as I say, went to Glasgow. He's back here now. I've been talking to him a lot about research. He's really interested in open research. So that's his orchid profile. So as you can see, he's employed now at the University of Leeds, but he was at the University of Glasgow. All his works are here as well. So all his publications, which are automatically pulled into there. So it just joins everything up, including the data as well, will be here as well, I think. So that's the data set in our repository. So that links back to the tool. So it just shows how everything's sort of interlinked together. The funding information, etc. And then these are the files associated with that. Including the this is something called shapefile. I don't quite understand it, but it's a map of global peat distribution, which has actually been really popular. It's our most popular data set in the repository. And in addition to that, if you've heard of altmetrics, you can see this colourful donut. This shows you how this research has been used and shared online. So if I click through to the details there, it'll show us how it's been mentioned in news articles, including the conversation, and obviously all this is benefited by the fact that the data is open and accessible. You know, we're not just talking to other academics, we're getting out there. It's been mentioned on blogs. It's even been mentioned in policy documents as well. It's been mentioned on Twitter quite a lot. I mean, this was a nice example as well. So I was talking to Jiren and how colleagues in totally different disciplines were interested in wildfire, I think. So he was, and because peat is implemented, and again, I'm no scientist, I don't know the ins and outs, but an interesting discussion that this is of value to colleagues working in entirely different disciplines to Jiren himself, because it's publicly open, people can access it and use it for things that Jiren didn't know about. And I was talking to him recently, actually, he's doing another project now on peat lands in the ancient world. Sounds fascinating. So there's lots of interesting things that can happen through open research. It's been mentioned on Facebook and Wikipedia. So I actually put this on Wikipedia because the way I advocate, Wikipedia can have a mixed reception in academia, but if you think somebody's going to Google something, where they're going to land, they're not going to land on your research paper, they're going to land on Wikipedia. And my argument is that we as a university, as academia, have a responsibility to make sure that it's properly cited and as accurate as it can be. So this is peat map. This is the actual output of all those shape files there, which is cited in this article, which is picked up by Altmetric, and then we can click through to see that on Wikimedia Commons. So this is where this is then linked back to our repository. You see there's a license information here, and that links back to our repository, and it'll show you this has actually been used on other wikis in different languages. So that's the English Wikipedia, but it's also been used on, I'm not even sure what that is it Bulgarian or az.wikipedia, so, and on Chinese Wikipedia, I think, which has been translated automatically for you. So again, it just shows you how material can be used in, also at least in a Welsh version as well. So there's a Welsh language version as well. So research can be very easily repurposed when it's open. So I think it's quite a nice example that we've written up in a case study as well. We'll go back to the slides. And that really brings us, to benefit 4 in the fact that innovation thrives on collaboration. I mean, that was a word that came out right at the outset, and what we're advocating is collaboration. And the University of Leeds in particular is really advocating this, trying to get away from competition and publish or perish, and really for the benefit of science, we need to change culture. Wider reach, wider impact, including outside academia. interdisciplinary research is the future. You know, help your work to reach others. That's what we're really, you know, trying to move towards. So nearly there now. As I said, I don't think we're going to need the full hour and a half, but there's lots of activity going on around the university. So UKRN, please. So UKRN is the UK Reproducibility Network. There's a website there that you can join if you want to join the team. If you use Microsoft Teams, there's a team for UKRN leads. So this is anybody interested in open research and reproducibility at Leeds. We are, as a university, now formally joining UKRN. That's just been approved, so there's going to be a lot more activity with the UKRN. We had a meeting yesterday actually with colleagues from that organisation. Really strongly recommend Reproducibility. So this is a play on words, a pun, which is a journal club run by early career researchers. If you're interested in getting involved with that, then you can do so. I've learned loads from that. They're just regular conversations. You know, you read an article about some aspect of open or reproducible research, and we just have an online conversation about it. Lots of different universities run them. They're all open now. You know, since COVID, we can go to each other's events and stuff. I strongly recommend following up on those. There'll be something of interest to your particular discipline, etc. So yeah, there's lots of stuff going on there, and there'll be more so that you'll hear about. We in the library run what we call an open lunch series. Perhaps again, Rachel, if you actually, I've got the link here. So we've had lots of great speakers at those events. They're all recorded and on the blog. We've had, you'll see from that link, we've had conversations around citizen science. Octopus is the tool that's a bit like pre-registration. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about that, Wikimedia, this stuff about diamond open access, with you know, in terms of that isn't actually cost to publish. This stuff on responsible research assessment and how we actually, you know, value what we do in research. Pre-registration. There's all sorts of stuff on there, and we'll have more events running soon, including the next one will be on the open research statement that I mentioned earlier, that's be published soon. And the most recent one that's on there is my colleague Dorcas here today, was about disciplinary differences. So you'll see the most recent one is something, an event called Case by Case. So this was where Dorcas, as I say, who's here today, and myself and another colleague were talking about this project to look at open research in different disciplines. At the moment, we've only published a small selection of them. So there's one from the School of English. They're all linked on the blog if you want to see them. One from the School of Mathematics, one on open education, one on health sciences and reproducibility, and one on the PEAT-MET project we were just looking at. Lots more to come. So how many are there, Dorcas? About 50, I think, in all, haven't we? So yeah, we'll get those out soon, and lots of interesting stuff there. 51 now, great, thanks. UKRN have also been doing some work in this area as well. So they've been doing similar sort of case studies in a range of disciplines. If you go to ukrn.org/disciplines, you'll see them all there. I haven't actually had a proper look myself yet. They're only recently released, but you'll see this stuff in archaeology and classics, artificial intelligence, history, there's one there. Psychology, engineering, veterinary science. I think they're planning more. Some of those are from Leeds as well. So a colleague of ours, I'm trying to think which one he would have done, who's our local lead for UKRN. So there's lots of information there, and also worth looking at the primers on the UKRN site as well. So there's what they call their primers on data sharing, open access, open code and software, and preprints, and some of the stuff that we've been talking about today. In terms of further information and support, in addition to this course, as I say, Rachel and I do one on research data management, essentials as it's called. We've got another course our colleague Brenda does on safeguarding data, you know, if you are dealing with sensitive data. We've also got courses on open access, raising research visibility, goes into a bit more detail on some of the things we've touched on, EndNote, bibliometrics, literature searching. So if you want support with any of that, have a look on the library website, and or just get in touch. You know, we can help you with any of this. These are examples of some of the workshops that we run. So you'll find them on the library website there. That bit.ly URL should work. I'll post a link in a moment. So yeah, just bringing it all together really, sort of a summary. we've talked about open access to publications and how funder policies are related to that. There's journal policies, and that's developing in terms of how stuff is being made open access. Preprints is a big aspect to that. We've talked about open research data, how researcher attitudes. I mean, that was an interesting conversation with Mark just now around, the politics of some of that. Funder policies are increasingly driving that as well. Lots of research data repositories. Again, any of this you're not sure about, get in touch. There's a wide range of skills that you as researchers will need, and we as support staff need to develop as well. Open code we've touched on, so things like GitHub and Zenodo and software licenses and communication, whether that's open peer review. I haven't even talked about. There's another event I'm going to at Sheffield later, actually virtual, talking about that. Some of the networks that you can build up through things like Twitter, etc., and use Altmetrics. I showed the Altmetrics example from PeatMap and how that's show you how research is being shared online. And yeah, we really are talking about the fact that open should be the default, not the exception. It's about faster dissemination impact. There is some self-interest, for your own use of your own data and access to your own data. Be the change you want to see. As I say, this is the way science is going, and please be our advocates in your own disciplines, because as I often say, I'm not an expert in any discipline. We're generalists. We need you, disciplinary experts, to sort of help us to understand what open means in particular contexts. And it's all about collaboration. With more collaboration, we can have wider reach, wider impact outside academia, and that leads to greater innovation. So that's the end. As I said, we didn't quite need. I'll stick around, and we'll stop recording if anybody does want to. That's the recording from Dorka. Thank you.